Let me get this open underway. I think it will be informative and entertaining because this is your opening statement. When supposed experts or analysts accept payments from the very industries whose products or practices they publicly promote, the consequences extend far beyond individual ethics. I hope you enjoyed the alliteration I put in there. That was for you nerds. It erodes trust, public trust. It distorts the evidence base that guides things like policy and behavior. It's deeply dishonest. It leads to preventable harm on a mass scale. Without full transparency about who's being paid what and by whom, what appears to be objective, independent analysis is actually shaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes very aggressively, by financial interests. The harm is broad. It's multifaceted. It leads both policymakers and the public. It misleads policymakers and the public about risks and delay changes that could save lives. Economically, it can impose enormous costs through things like increased healthcare burdens, lost productivity, environmental cleanup. Socially, it undermines faith in institutions. It fuels skepticism that spills over into other areas. When revelations eventually surface, and they often do, sometimes though not until decades later, and sometimes it takes investigative journalism or even lawsuits or some sort of archival research, the damage is already done. Accountability is difficult to achieve decades after the harm has been committed. In the mid-1960s, concerns were growing about the links between table sugar and heart disease. The sugar industry founded the not so subtly named Sugar Research Foundation. Their job was to take proactive steps to protect big sugar. Internal documents show that the industry was alarmed. Emerging research, a lot of it linking sugar to heart disease and whatnot, we're starting to show that low-fat, high-sugar diets often raised cholesterol, caused obesity. And rather than fund a neutral inquiry, the Sugar Research Foundation was born. It was funded by Big Sugar to do a literature review. And they hired prominent Harvard nutrition researchers. And the industry paid them handsomely. The Sugar Research Foundation not only provided the funding, it also selected the papers that would be included in the research. It supplied critical studies for rebuttal of other research, and it reviewed drafts. And it explicitly directed the work of the scientists to emphasize things like fat and cholesterol as the primary dietary culprits, while of course downplaying and critiquing evidence that sugar might actually be the cause. The result was a two-part review. It appeared in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine back in 1967, and it concluded there was no doubt that reducing dietary cholesterol and replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats were the key that would prevent or even reverse heart disease. And it applied a very skeptical lens to any study implicating sugar. Crucially, the Sugar Research Foundation's role, including their funding, their influence, it was never disclosed. This was a standard practice at the time. There weren't as many conflict of interest requirements, disclosure requirements. Those that existed were minimal. I don't want to say minimal, but basically non-existent in most journals. Most physicians, nutritionists, and even the public had no idea that this influential paper, this groundbreaking study that helped steer dietary guidelines towards low-fat recommendations for decades, was actually shaped, funded, and created by Big Sugar. The 1980 U.S. Dietary Guidelines, all subsequent advice focused heavily on fat reduction while ignoring added sugars. This contributed to a shift in the food supply, believe it or not. All of a sudden, mass production of food that was low fat, high sugar started being consumed by everyone. It also happened to coincide with skyrocketing and unprecedented rates of heart disease and obesity. Revelations came only in 2016, just 10 years ago. Researchers at the University of California, San Francisco published an analysis of internal Sugar Research Foundation documents. And the exposure highlighted how industry-sponsored research had successfully cast doubt on sugar's hazards and promoted fat as the dietary villain in heart disease. Well, that's sugar. What about drugs? Well, by now we're mostly all aware of Purdue Pharma's handling of OxyContin and how it represents one of the most consequential examples of this type of pay-to-play fraud in modern pharmaceutical history. OxyContin was introduced in the mid-1990s. It was a controlled release opioid for moderate to severe pain and was aggressively marketed as having a lower risk for addiction and abuse compared to other drugs on the market. These are claims that company documents and later admissions by company employees showed were at best misleading. Company trained its sales force to tell doctors that the risk of addiction was less than 1%. It promoted the concept of pseudo-addiction. This framed behaviors like requesting higher doses or early refills not as signs of dependence, but as indicators of untreated pain. The antidote to untreated pain, of course, was even more Purdue Pharma medication. Purdue funded continuing medical education classes. They paid key opinion leaders like physicians and researchers to be speakers and consultants. And they developed extensive promotional materials that downplayed the risks and emphasized the benefits of chronic non-cancer pain. Benefits for chronic non-cancer pain. It worked. It worked spectacularly. Too spectacularly. Sales exploded from the relatively modest beginnings in the mid-1990s to billions and billions of dollars annually. The wild success fueled even more widespread overprescribing. Most doctors and patients didn't have any idea. The financial relationships and marketing incentives were driving the narrative. In 2007, Purdue and 3 top executives pleaded guilty to criminal charges of misbranding the drug OxyContin. The company later agreed to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and settlements. Later revelations through lawsuits showed the company knew about diversion and abuse, but they continued the aggressive promotion anyway. And this campaign played a significant role in the global, and particularly here in America, opioid epidemic, contributed to hundreds of thousands of overdose deaths, widespread addiction. The hidden financial ties between the company and the experts shaping the prescribing practices, well, that meant that independent medical judgment was necessarily compromised. The patients ultimately were the ones who suffered. The company and the doctors did quite well during those years. Further settlements and bankruptcy proceedings in subsequent years underscored the scale of the deception. Perhaps the longest running example of this type of insidious behavior involves a chemical called tetraethyl lead. This is the type of lead that was added to gasoline back in the 1920s. It was a partnership between giant companies like General Motors, Standard Oil, DuPont, and they did it through a company called the Ethyl Corporation. Even at the time, lead was known to be a pretty potent neurotoxin. There were even documented cases of poisoning among the workers who were merely handling the tetraethyl lead. In October 1924, a disaster at a Standard Oil refinery in Bayway, New Jersey, saw dozens of workers suffer lead poisoning. Symptoms were hard to miss. They included things like hallucinations, insanity, and several deaths. Several incidents occurred at other facilities. Rather than halt or even seriously investigate this widespread use of tetraethyl lead, the industry naturally downplayed the risks. They argued that the extreme dilution in gasoline made public exposure relatively negligible. At a 1925 U.S. Public Health Service hearing, industry representatives framed concerns as limited to refinery safety. There was no broader public health concern, they argued. Experts advocating alternatives were marginalized. Public hearings were shortened or even canceled. The industry changed the name of the molecule from tetraethyl lead to ethyl. They promoted ethyl gas, and they avoided the word lead in marketing to prevent alarm. They influenced or supported research that minimized the dangers and even later attacked the independent scientists themselves. Their favorite line of attack, tell me if this sounds familiar, was to accuse these scientists of being crazy or evil, or at the very least, fraudulent or biased. For decades, most people, including drivers, parents, and even many physicians, had no idea the extent of the lead gasoline industry's knowledge of their own product's harm, much less of the efforts to suppress concerns being raised. Leaded gasoline remained pretty dominant until catalytic converters necessitated its phase-out beginning in the 1970s. The United States did not officially ban leaded gas until 1996. Long-term consequences of the leaded gas that we all, you were alive at the time, all lived around. Widespread IQ reductions, millions of premature deaths, increased rates of behavioral and cardiovascular issues, persistent environmental contamination. These are just 3 cases. There are countless more that share striking similarities. Industries face inconvenient evidence, responded not with open scientific debate, but with targeted funding, selective research, narrative control, and secrecy about their conflicts. In each instance, the payments or the incentives were largely invisible to the public, and even to many in the relevant professions at the time. Revelations almost always came too late, but they only came through persistent researchers digging into archives. Maybe they relied on whistleblowers or lawsuits, sometimes investigative reporting. And in nearly every single instance, it was long after the policies that were shaped had already accumulated harm. The broader lesson here is pretty clear. Undisclosed industry funding, undisclosed research, undisclosed funded messaging creates this systemic bias. It protects the insiders and it harms the public. The pattern has been perfected. And unfortunately, it's being pushed into non-industrial usage. Tonight, we'll take a look at a few of the people being paid to shape public opinion on what is perhaps the most high-profile and consequential political event of the past several years. And that is the investigation into who killed Charlie Kirk, how, and why. And that is your opening statement.